What is going on, everyone? In today's video, we're going to be talking about the history of fire mages. Now, I realize this is probably going to be a long video, and I apologize in advance, but I really think this is a very fun and nostalgic subject to talk about, and hopefully this will bring back some good memories for a lot of you. I know it does for me, and just thinking about the changes that fire mages have been through over the course of these expansions are pretty cool to talk about. They're pretty fun, and yeah, so let's get into it. Going back to vanilla. So in vanilla WoW, fire mages were, in terms of DPS, they were incredibly strong in raid environments. You know, outside of things like doing damage in Molten Core, which was basically impossible as a fire mage because just the bosses were immune and completely resistant to your damage. Fire mages were really strong in terms of DPS. They were a great class. They provided a lot of utility through things like buffs and decurses. And you had things outside of raiding like portal distribution service and conjuring water for random people. It was a pretty great experience. The things that, you know, made fire mages pretty cool was that you had the original form of combustion, which was essentially it gave your next spell a 100% chance to crit. But in vanilla, it later got changed to work pretty much how enhanced pyrotechnics works today. It basically stacked 10% crit each spell until you crit 3 times. So that was kind of how combustion stayed all the way until Wrath of the Lich King. But in vanilla, things were obviously really different. You know, you had portals and slowfall that needed reagents. You had improved scorch that basically you needed to scorch the boss 5 times to make them gave you more damage on your fire spells to the target. You had ranks for your spells. You had amplify magic. You had dampen magic. You had a ton of things. You had a lot of spells. You had a lot of talents to choose from. And fire mages back then were a really fun class to play. If you enjoyed the glass cannon, high risk, high reward type of class, this was the class for you. In PvP, you had those, you know, fire mage montages with their palm pyros, and you can just one-shot people. It was fun, but it was a higher risk, high reward type of gameplay. And I think, you know, when Classic comes out, a lot of people are going to feel nostalgic just going into a battleground with their trinket up and their arcane power up and just blasting people. But yeah, in vanilla WoW, fire mages were pretty fun to play. And if you were a master at the spec, you dominated a lot of PvP, and you were a great DPS to have in a raid environment. You know, at times like in Molten Core, obviously you couldn't play fire because a lot of the bosses were resistant, like I had said. So you had to kind of just either use Frostbolt or go Frost or Arcane. But generally speaking, in vanilla WoW, fire mages were a great class in terms of DPS, and they brought a lot of utility to raids. And like we were talking about before, combustion stayed that way all the way up until Wrath of the Lich King. But first, let's just jump to Burning Crusade and talk about a little bit of the changes that they went through. So when Burning Crusade came out, obviously you got access to a lot more talents. You had a couple more spells that were introduced, and Burning Crusade was generally seen as the expansion that kind of balanced everything out. You know, there were a lot of imbalances in vanilla, and Burning Crusade a lot of balance issues to rest. Again, fire mages were a great class in raiding. They were really high DPS spec. You still had things like the improved scorch that you had to keep on your target, and in terms of rotation, nothing really changed. You had access to a new ability, Dragon's Breath, which was introduced for the first time. But in a raid environment, they were still great DPS. You were essentially just a scorch and fireball bot. You still had things like conjured mana emerald or mana gem. It was, again, the high risk, high reward glass cannon type of thing, but they didn't really see many changes outside of those couple of talent tweaks and balancing issues. But when you jump to Wrath, that's when you started to see fire mages becoming this like incredibly strong AoE bot that you really wanted to have in a raid environment. So jumping into Wrath of the Lich King, Combustion saw its real first iteration change. Combustion was changed to increase your crit damage by your fire spells by 50% in addition to the enhanced pyrotechnics type mechanic that we saw in vanilla. And in Wrath, there were a couple of changes that the class went through in terms of talents. If you look at the talent tree that's on the screen here, you'll see that the talent tree went a lot deeper. You got access to things like Living Bomb, which was amazing. The talent tree just got a little bit more expansive, and you had a little bit more choice in terms of what you were taking. But again, fire mages were still a great class to have in Wrath. They were great on AoE. They provided a lot of single target DPS as well, and the utility kind of still stayed the same. They were still that all-around core DPS class that you wanted to have in a raid environment. But the biggest change came when Cataclysm was released. If any of you guys played a Fire Mage like I did, you'll know that Cataclysm was probably the best that Fire Mage ever felt in terms of damage and in terms of just overall toolkit, overall ability, overall utility. So in Cataclysm, we saw another change to Combustion, and this was probably everyone's favorite change. But essentially what happened was that Combustion was turned into a 2-minute cooldown, and it combined all of your dots to create its own massive dot on the target that was based on the ignite damage, and it just made its own dot. It combined that damage over 10 seconds. Here we saw an introduction of Fire Blast and Impact, which essentially made that your fire spells had a chance to reset the cooldown on your Fire Blast, and it would stun the target for 2 seconds if you used Fire Blast on a stunnable target, and it spread Combustion to everything. If you had 40 targets around the boss that you were killing, like let's say on Zekvaz in Dragon Soul, whatever the fuck it was called, you did ridiculous amounts of damage. Fire Mage DPS was unmatched in AoE. You were the AoE king in Cataclysm, and I think a lot of people that played Fire Mage and that mained Fire Mage back then will agree with me when I say that it felt amazing to press Combustion. If you use that add-on that everyone used back then, it's called I think it was called Combustion Tracker, and essentially Combustion Helper, I think it was called. And essentially you had this little box at the bottom of your screen. It would tell you your ignite damage and your pyroblast damage, and it would calculate the damage that your combustion ticks would do. And when that add-on lit up in green, you knew that you were going to have a disgusting amount of damage coming out of your combustion. Fire mages were just so amazing back then. You had access to things like Living Bomb. You had access to things like Flame Orb or Frost Orb or whatever it was. When you were geared out the ass in Dragon Soul, you had Wrath Rack, you had Cunning of the Cruel, that AoE Shadow Bolt trinket, and if you went into a battleground geared out the ass as a fire mage, you were just destroying everything, and it felt amazing. And granted, it was probably incredibly overpowered, but fire mages just felt so good in Cataclysm. I can't say more than that. They just felt amazing. And generally, combustion kind of stayed the same, kind of close, all the way up until it changed in Legion this way. It went through a couple more iterations we'll talk about, but generally speaking, this is how combustion is loved and remembered as being the pillar of Fire Mage. I talk about combustion so much because the way that combustion is now is such a, when you think back to how combustion used to be, it's such a dramatic shift in terms of how the class feels, because back then we had so many more abilities, our toolkit was amazing, everything just kind of synergized really well, and you felt like a fire mage. The class identity was really, really strong. So I'm harping on combustion, but for me, it just felt like such a great cooldown, and it was just an amazing ability. In Cataclysm, we saw another talent tree revision. Things were a little bit shortened, and we had access to things that we had access to before, but things were kind of just shortened and trimmed down a little bit because it was getting out of hand. There were a lot of spells and a lot of things you had access to that weren't really necessary. But generally speaking, the talent tree kind of stayed the same. You had access now to like things like Hot Streak and Cauterize. But yeah, again, fire mages felt amazing in Cataclysm, and they were, in my personal opinion, that's the best that fire mage ever felt for me. But jumping into Mists of Pandaria, we saw some more changes. The introduction of Infernal Blast basically combined the impact talent with your Fire Blast, and this was the first time that we ever saw the new talent tree get implemented. So away we went with the old skill point tree system, and we came into the talent tree that we know now. So you can see that we had access to like Presence of Mind, Scorch, and Ice Flows on the first tree. So now we're getting into the part of WoW where we started to have fewer selections, but those selections were more meaningful in terms of what you chose. And they generally altered your gameplay or added a lot of utility to your gameplay that you didn't have before. So you had things like Invocation that utilized your evocation cooldown. You had Rune of Power, you had Nether Tempest, you had Greater Invisibility, Cold Snap if you wanted it. You just had you could choose a lot of things outside of the fire tree that you wanted, and it generally just altered your gameplay and gave you a lot more utility in certain situations. So there was a lot of debate at this time with implementation of this skill tree, but generally it was well received. I think people missed being able to really fine-tune their choices, but at the same time, it made those choices a lot easier for a lot of people. Here we again saw Combustion go through another change. It instantly dealt damage now and stunned the target for 3 seconds. And it stayed the same in the sense that it burned the target over 10 seconds based on your Ignite and Pyroblast damage. And when you used it, it reset the cooldown on your Infernal Blast. And like we said before, Infernal Blast basically combined the Impact and Fire Blast spells. So it blasted the enemy for a percentage of your spell power, and then spread your fire damage effects to up to 3 enemies. That was the biggest change. If you had a glyph, it would change it to 4 enemies, but now Combustion didn't spread to everything around you, it just spread to 4. So that was one of the biggest change. So like I said before, you had a glyph that would basically increase the duration and damage of your Combustion. You had one that would increase the amount of targets that Combustion spread to. But generally speaking, in terms of damage, Fire Mages were again really, really strong. They were great at AoE, great at single target, and they were just very, very fun to play in MoP. I remember specifically being on Siegecrafter Black Fuse, and just destroying the damage meter with things like Altered Time, and you had access to so many fun abilities. The Invoker's Energy talent or Invocation talent really added a different, unique playstyle. You had things like Presence of Mind, you had Mage Armors, there was a lot more to use in the Mage toolkit, and it generally felt really, really good. So moving through MoP, we go into WoD. Now, WoD was, in my opinion, probably the second best that Fire Mage ever felt for me. We saw the introduction of new talents, and with that new talent, we had something called Prismatic Crystal. Now, Prismatic Crystal, early on in Fire Mage gameplay, like at the beginning of WoD, didn't feel too great, but towards the end where Hellfire Citadel was in play, it felt amazing to play a Fire Mage with PC. We had access to a new talent called Evanesce, which was essentially a mini ice block, but you were able to move and cast while you had it on you. It was amazing. We saw things like Meteor, Blazing Speed, Ice Flows. It just felt really, really good. And at the end of WoD, when you had I remember making a guide back then, when you had the 2 trinkets like the Sandman's Pouch and the medallion off of Council or whatever it was, when you had your full rotations up and you were able to do damage into your Prismatic Crystal, Combustion felt really, really good. And speaking of Combustion, it got changed again. It basically reset the cooldown on your Infernal Blast when you used it. It didn't do direct damage, it didn't stun. It combined all your Ignite damage and burnt the target for an additional 10 seconds, equal to the damage of your Ignite dot. But now, basically, it was reverted to do no damage with no stun, but they increased the amount of targets it spread to up until 5 when you used Infernal Blast. So you were able to spread your Combustion off your Prismatic Crystal, and it felt really, really good. So again, Fire Mage is generally known as being a very good DPS class. They were a core DPS class. They felt awesome. But things like Arcane and WoD started to shine a little bit more because of the Hellfire Citadel trinket and the 4-piece for the tier. We started to see other specs start to dominate the DPS meter, and Fire was still a viable option. It was great. It was a great option, but now we started to see a lot more specs coming into play and being more viable in raiding environments. Now moving from WoD into Legion, this is the biggest change that Combustion has seen. It was completely reworked. It didn't work the same way at all anymore, and it essentially just gave you a 2-minute cooldown. When you pressed it, it gave you 100% crit and mastery equal to your crit rating. So this was the biggest change that Combustion went through, in my opinion, and it completely changed the playstyle of Fire Mages. Early on in Legion, Fire Mages were great. We had access to things like Ice Flows and Cinderstorm, and they were a really, really good DPS class in Emerald Nightmare. And as we approached later and later in Legion, Fire Mages kind of saw a dip, and Arcane and Frost started to be really, really good DPS classes. And at the end of Legion is when Fire Mages felt amazing. You had all your legendaries, you had access to all of your artifact talents, and Fire Mages felt incredibly smooth. And when we're speaking of Fire Mages in all of WoW history, I think the smoothest Fire Mages have felt were at the end of Legion. You had crazy amounts of stats, when you were playing like things like crit build, things felt really, really strong, and you felt like you were always doing damage, and things just felt really smooth, really quick. It was a high-paced, high-risk, high-reward type of spec, and I really enjoyed it. But yeah, the history of Fire Mages goes really, really far, and I probably didn't cover everything I wanted to cover, but if you look back and you think about Fire Mages and how many changes they've been through, it's really interesting to see how many things and how far the game has come in terms of pruning talents and changing up abilities. And now we're kind of in the position in BFA where everything's been funneled down into, a handful of talents, and it doesn't feel really that great. And I wanted to make this video just to kind of reminisce and be a little bit nostalgic on what it was like playing back then. And some people never got to experience, Cataclysm Fire Mages with Combustion, or, Mists of Pandaria, Alter Time. Like, no one ever really, if you didn't play back then, you didn't really experience it, obviously. But Fire Mages were really different back then, and they were always a great spec. They were always a great DPS class to play, and they were generally always fun. And even now, obviously, we don't have access to all those abilities anymore. It's been really pruned, but they're still a fun class to play, and I'm still playing them. And hopefully, when Classic comes out, we'll get to bring back some of that nostalgia and play a great class again. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I know this was brief, but if you enjoyed it, drop a comment. Tell me what your favorite Fire Mage expansion was, what you enjoyed the most about the class, and yeah. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you later. Peace out.